Seeking shelter from winter storms, a homeless craftsman discovers an abandoned cabin deep in the Adirondacks. With skilled hands and determination, he begins restoring it to its former glory, finding purpose in each repaired board and rusty nail. But this sanctuary holds an extraordinary secret. It belongs to Katherine Wells, now a powerful billionaire, and the woman who captured his heart 30 years ago. As she returns to check on her property, neither expects to confront the love they thought was lost forever, or the choices that forced them apart. In the very place where their story began, they'll discover if time has truly healed old wounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind howled through the Adirondack forests, carrying the first bitter promise of winter. James Morgan pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, his weathered hands seeking warmth in pockets that had long since worn thin. The setting sun painted the snow-laden clouds in shades of amber and purple, a beautiful sight he might have appreciated more if he wasn't desperately seeking shelter before nightfall. A half-fallen "No Trespassing" sign creaked in the wind, barely clinging to an ancient maple tree. James hardly noticed it as he trudged through the deepening snow, his worn boots leaving heavy tracks in the pristine white blanket. 20 years as a master carpenter, and here he was, searching for any refuge from the approaching storm. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built homes for others most of his life, and now he couldn't even keep one for himself. Through the thickening snowfall, a dark shape emerged among the trees. At first, James thought it was just another shadow, but as he drew closer, the distinct angles of a roofline became visible. A cabin, old and weather-beaten, but still standing. His carpenter's eye immediately catalogued the sagging corners, the missing shingles, the way the front porch listed slightly to the left. The place had good bones, though. He could tell, even from this distance. In the corner of the porch, partially hidden by years of fallen leaves, he spotted something that made his heart skip. An old toolbox. Its red paint faded to a dusty pink, but sturdy Stanley craftsmanship still evident in its lines. Inside, beneath, a layer of dust and cobwebs, lay a basic set of carpentry tools: hammer, saw, chisels, all of them old but serviceable. It was like finding buried treasure, though the real value wasn't in the tools themselves, but in what they represented. Possibility. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as he tested the front door. It was locked, but the frame had warped enough that a firm shoulder against the right spot did the trick. The door groaned open, hinges protesting years of disuse. James stepped inside, out of the wind, and felt the cabin close around him like a forgotten embrace. He found an old kerosene lamp on a shelf, its brass base tarnished but its glass chimney miraculously intact. With hands that remembered such things, he checked. The oil level trimmed the wick and soon had a warm glow pushing back the shadows. In its light, the cabin revealed itself, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, 2 doors leading to what he assumed were bedrooms. Near the fireplace, a stack of old newspapers caught his eye. The dates were faded, but he could make out 1993 on one of them. 30 years of dust and silence, 30 years since, but he pushed that thought away. The past was the past, and he had more immediate concerns, like surviving the winter that was bearing down on the mountains with all the subtlety of a freight train. James set the lamp down and shrugged off his backpack. He had some basic supplies, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, matches, but now he had something else too, a project, a purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to rebuild more than just this cabin. Dawn brought weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating decades of neglect. James had spent the night in his sleeping bag near the fireplace, too exhausted to do more than clear a small space on the floor. Now, with morning's clarity, he began a proper assessment of his temporary sanctuary. Behind a stack of moldering cardboard boxes, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken, a rolled-up set of blueprints, their edges eaten by time, but their contents still legible. He carefully unrolled them on the dusty floor, recognizing the precise lines of professional architectural drawings. The cabin's original design was revealed in careful detail: floor plans, elevation drawings, even specific notes about materials and construction methods. Something about the drafting style tugged at his memory, but he pushed the thought aside. Instead, he focused on the practical implications. These blueprints would be invaluable for the repairs he needed to make. The roof was his first priority. Several leaks had made themselves known during the night's snowfall. Working methodically, James began clearing the main room. Years of leaves and debris had blown in through broken windows and gaps in the walls. He found himself sorting through the detritus carefully, setting aside anything that might be useful. A bent nail could be straightened, a warped board might still have good sections. The toolbox from the porch proved to be a godsend. The old hammer felt right in his hand, awakening muscle memories from better days. He started with the windows, removing the broken panes and boarding them up properly. Each strike of the hammer seemed to shake loose fragments of his past, the satisfaction of a job well done, the pride in creating something lasting. By midday, he had cleared enough space to really see what he was dealing with. The cabin structure was fundamentally sound, built by someone who knew what they were doing. The deterioration was mostly superficial: weather damage, neglect, and time taking their toll. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with skill and patience, two things James had in abundance, even if he had little else. He found himself talking aloud as he worked, a habit from his contracting days. Support beam's solid, just needs cleaning. That junction box will have to be replaced entirely. Who did the original wiring here? Nice work, actually. The sound of his voice seemed to wake something in the cabin's atmosphere. As the space grew cleaner, more ordered, it felt less like an abandoned shell and more like a place where life could flourish again. James tried not to think about how long he might be able to stay, about the property's real owners who could show up any day. Instead, he focused on each immediate task, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of repair work. Late afternoon found him on the roof, patching the worst of the leaks with materials scavenged from a fallen shed behind the cabin. The valley held its breath beneath him, winter-bare trees stretching to the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. The blueprints had been carefully re-rolled and stored safely away from any remaining leaks. He hadn't studied them too closely. Something about them made him uneasy, stirred memories he wasn't ready to face. But they were there if he needed them, like a conversation waiting to be had. The cover of Forbes magazine gleamed on Katherine Wells's desk, her own image staring back at her with practiced confidence. The Infrastructure Queen: How Katherine Wells Built a $4.2 billion empire from the ground up. She hadn't bothered to read the article. She'd lived it after all. Instead, her attention was fixed on the email from her property manager in the Adirondacks. Suspicious activity reported at the cabin property. Local utilities noticed power readings. Recommend immediate inspection. Catherine's fingers tensed on her mouse. That cabin. She'd meant to sell it a dozen times over the years, but something always held her back. Now sitting in her corner office 50 stories above Manhattan, she felt its pull like an undertow. "Ms. Wells," her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board is waiting in the conference room. Tell them 5 minutes." Katherine stood, smoothing her tailored suit. The wall of windows offered a pristine view of Central Park, dusted with early snow, so different from the wild forests of her youth. On her desk, beside the magazine, sat a small model of her company's latest project, a sustainable housing development that would reinvent urban living. Everything she touched turned to success these days. The board meeting passed in a blur of quarterly projections and expansion strategies. Katherine played her role perfectly, the visionary CEO, the steady hand at the helm. None of them knew about the cabin, about the girl she'd been 30 years ago, about the dreams she'd packed away as carefully as the belongings she'd left behind in those woods. Excellent presentation on the Shanghai expansion. Roger Thompson, her CFO, caught up with her after the meeting. Though I noticed you didn't mention the Adirondack development opportunity. Katherine kept her expression neutral. Her company had been acquiring property in the region, planning a luxury resort complex. The cabin's location was perfect for the project's final phase. Still evaluating our options there. Back in her office, she found herself opening her personal safe. Behind the legal documents and backup drives sat a simple wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a single photograph she hadn't looked at in years. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but she could still make out two young faces, bright with possibility. She'd been 19, he'd been 22. The cabin stood proud in the background, newly built, a testament to his skill and their shared dreams. Her intercom buzzed again. "Miss Wells, your 3 o'clock is here." Katherine returned the photo to its hiding place. She had built this life carefully, methodically, each success a brick in the wall between then and now. But as she prepared to meet her next appointment, her mind kept drifting back to the email about the cabin. Someone was up there, bringing power and life back to a place she'd tried so hard to forget. The magazine on her desk caught her eye again. The article praised her instincts, her ability to see potential where others saw only decay. She reached for her phone. "Cancel my meetings for the next 3 days," she told her assistant, "and have the car brought around. I'm taking a trip upstate." She had built an empire by knowing when to tear down and when to rebuild. But some foundations ran deeper than business, and some structures couldn't be replaced with steel and glass. As the elevator carried her down to the waiting car, Katherine felt time folding in on itself, bringing the past rushing forward like a winter storm. The third day of repairs brought James to the living room's main support beam. He was clearing away decades of cobwebs when his hand brushed against something carved into the wood. Wiping away years of grime, his breath caught in his throat. There, preserved in the sturdy oak, was a heart with initials inside. JM plus KW. His fingers traced the familiar carving, remembering the summer evening he'd put it there. Katherine had teased him about being sentimental, but her eyes had sparkled when he'd finished. "Now we're part of the cabin's bones," she'd said. He could still hear the laugh in her voice, still feel the warmth of her beside him as they'd planned their future. James stepped back from the beam, his hands trembling slightly. He'd been so focused on the physical work of repair, he'd almost managed to forget whose cabin this was. Almost managed to forget the young woman with dreams as big as the mountains around them, the one who'd drawn up the blueprints he'd been afraid to study too closely. Moving to the kitchen, he tried to lose himself in work again. The counter needed replacing, its surface warped beyond repair. As he pried up the old wood, something fluttered to the floor, a yellowed piece of paper covered in Katherine's precise architectural handwriting. Notes about the counter height, about the exact type of wood to use, little details that showed how much thought she'd put into every inch of this place. He remembered watching her work on the designs, bent over her drafting table in the soft morning light. She'd had such vision, such talent. Even then, he'd known she was destined for bigger things than their small-town life could offer. He just hadn't known how much it would cost them both. The sound of a car engine in the distance snapped him back to the present. Probably just someone using the old logging road, but it reminded him of his precarious situation. He was trespassing, after all, squatting in a cabin that belonged to his past. Soon, he'd have to move on, find another place to weather the winter, but not yet. There was still work to be done. Repairs that couldn't wait if the cabin was to survive another season. He owed it that much at least, to leave it better than he'd found it. Even if he couldn't do the same for the dreams he'd carved into that beam so long ago. James returned to the living room, unable to resist one more look at the carved heart. In the late afternoon light, the initials seemed to pulse with memory, with possibilities long buried, but not quite dead, like the cabin. Itself they had endured, waiting in silence for someone to uncover them again. The collection of salvaged materials grew slowly but steadily. Stacks of lumber from the collapsed shed, salvageable shingles, boxes of nails carefully straightened by firelight. James arranged everything meticulously on the porch, each piece a promise of renewal. His experience told him which materials could be saved and which were too far gone. Knowledge earned through decades of turning other people's cast-offs into something valuable. The irony wasn't lost on him. 8 months ago, he'd been sleeping under a bridge in Burlington, his contractor's license long expired. His reputation buried under the avalanche of medical bills and missed deadlines that followed his accident. Now here he was, doing what he did best, even if he was essentially stealing shelter from someone else's property. As he worked, fragments of his past life surfaced like debris after a flood. The accident that shattered his leg had been mundane, a misstep on a rain-slick scaffold. But the complications that followed, the infection that kept him hospitalized, the clients who couldn't wait, he'd lost everything so gradually he barely noticed until it was gone. "Measure twice, cut once," he muttered, checking the dimensions of the replacement board. The old carpenter's adage brought a bitter smile to his face. If only life's mistakes could be avoided so easily. The snow had stopped, leaving the valley hushed and white. James had rigged up a makeshift workspace under the porch overhang, where he could sort materials and make repairs to smaller items. His hands remembered their craft, even if they were rougher now, marked by years of harder work and harder living. The pile of salvaged materials told its own story. Victorian-era oak floorboards, still solid beneath their weathered surface. Cedar shingles from the 1950s edition, pine timbers that might have been original to the cabin's construction. Each piece represented a layer of history, a different caretaker's contribution to this shelter in the woods. He was testing the strength of a recovered joist when the memory hit him. Katherine, fresh out of architecture school, explaining how she wanted to integrate the cabin's original structure with her modern additions. "It's about honoring what came before while building something new," she'd said, her eyes bright with purpose. She'd always seen the bigger picture, always looked toward the future, while he'd been content with the simple satisfaction of working with his hands. A blue jay's harsh call startled him from his reverie. The light was failing. Another day, almost gone. James gathered his tools, each one returned to its proper place in the old toolbox. He'd learned to be careful with what little he had. Inside, the cabin felt different now. The musty smell of decay had been replaced by the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood and honest work. He'd patched the worst of the roof leaks, sealed most of the drafts, and restored some basic functionality to the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That night, as he sat by the fireplace eating a can of soup warmed over a camping stove, James allowed himself to imagine staying. Not forever. He knew better than to hope for that. But long enough to see the cabin restored, to what it should be, what it had been when they'd first built it, back when everything seemed possible. The salvaged materials on the porch represented more than just building supplies. They were a second chance, not just for the cabin, but maybe for him too. Each piece, carefully saved, cleaned and repurposed, was a small step away from the man who'd lost everything, back toward the craftsman he'd once been. But second chances were tricky things. They came with strings attached, with debts to be paid and truths to be faced. As the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, James wondered how long he had before those truths caught up with him. The cabin's real owner would return eventually, and when that happened, all the salvaged lumber in the world wouldn't be enough to rebuild what had broken between them 30 years ago. Katherine's executive assistant hurried after her through the marble-floored corridor, waving a property deed. "Ms. Wells, the board needs your signature on the Adirondack acquisition today. The resort development timeline Can wait. Katherine continued walking, her heels clicking against the marble with military precision. I'm going to inspect the property myself first, but the investors will understand that I personally review all major acquisitions. She stopped at the elevator, finally turning to face her flustered assistant. That's why they trust us. With their money. The property deed's official seal caught the fluorescent lighting, a reminder of decisions made decades ago. She'd kept the cabin in her own name rather than transferring it to her company's holdings. A sentimental choice, the kind she rarely made anymore. Cancel my dinner with the Singapore investors, she said as the elevator arrived, and have legal send me the complete survey of the surrounding properties. I want to review everything before I head up there. In her private bathroom, Katherine studied her reflection as she reapplied her lipstick. At 52, she still turned heads, her dark hair now streaked with elegant silver that she'd never bothered to color. Power was its own kind of beauty, and she'd earned every grey hair building her empire. The deed sat in her briefcase like a live coal. She'd bought the surrounding acres gradually over the years, expanding outward from that original plot, as if the cabin were the center of a web. Now, that same land was the missing piece in a development that could add another billion to her company's value. Her phone buzzed, the head of her security team. We've confirmed activity at the cabin, ma'am. Local sources report seeing smoke from the chimney. Would you like us to send someone to... No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I'll handle it personally. Reaching into her desk, she withdrew her old set of cabin keys, kept separate from her other property keys. The brass had tarnished, but she could still make out the scratches where she'd marked them with her initials, back when she'd believed in putting her mark on things that mattered. The resort development plan spread across her desk told a different story. Glossy renderings of luxury chalets, a golf course, restaurants with mountain views. Progress measured in profit margins and property values. The cabin and its surrounding forest would be erased, replaced by something more profitable but less real. Roger appeared in her doorway. The board's concerns are noted. Katherine slipped the keys into her pocket. But this is still my company, and that is still my property. I'll make my decision after I've seen it for myself. She gathered her coat and briefcase, the familiar weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders. The deed felt heavy in her hand, a reminder that some properties carried more than just monetary value. Sometimes they held pieces of ourselves we weren't ready to demolish. Have my car brought around, she told her assistant, and make sure my schedule is clear for the next few days. This isn't a decision I intend to rush. The attic door had been stubborn, swollen with decades of moisture, but James finally managed to work it free. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight as he carefully tested each step of the narrow stairs. The accident had left him with a slight limp, a constant reminder to be cautious, especially when working alone. The attic space was surprisingly large, stretching the full length of the cabin. His light caught the gleam of cobwebs and the shapes of forgotten furniture, draped in sheets. But it was the old leather photo album that drew his attention, sitting on a trunk near the attic window, as if waiting to be found. The album's pages were stiff with age, but intact. The first photograph stopped his heart. Katherine on graduation day, her architecture degree in one hand, the cabin's blueprints in the other. He'd taken that picture himself, so proud of her accomplishments, not yet understanding how those same achievements would eventually tear them apart. More images followed, telling the story of the cabin's construction. Katherine checking the foundation work, James setting the support beams, both of them standing on the newly finished porch, young and dirty and laughing. The photos captured everything, the shared dream, the hard work, the love that seemed strong enough to last forever. We were just kids, he murmured, touching one. Of the images, they'd been so certain about everything back then. Katherine with her ambitious designs, him with his traditional craftsmanship. They'd thought they could bridge any gap with enough determination and love. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages, Katherine sleeping at her drafting table, surrounded by sketches of the cabin. He'd forgotten taking this one. She'd been working late, again, refining the plans until every detail was perfect. Even then, her drive had been incredible. It was one of the things he'd loved most about her, until it became the thing that drove them apart. The next section of the album was emptier, with obvious gaps where photos had been removed. The remaining images showed the cabin's completion, but the joy in them felt different, more subdued, as if the camera had caught the first hints of strain in their relationship. The final photograph was one he'd never seen before. Katherine, alone on the porch, looking out at the forest. The date stamp showed it was taken just days before she left for her internship at the prestigious firm in Manhattan. She'd promised it was temporary, just a stepping stone to bigger things for both of them, but temporary had become permanent, and bigger things had meant different things to each of them. James closed the album carefully. He should put it back, pretend he'd never found it. The past was the past, after all, but instead he found himself carrying it downstairs, placing it on the kitchen counter he'd just finished repairing. These memories were part of the cabin too, as much as the beams and boards he was restoring. The afternoon light caught the brass corners of the album, making them shine like new. He'd always appreciated how old things could be brought back too, life with proper care and attention. But some restorations were more complicated than others. Some things, once broken, left scars no amount of craftsmanship could completely hide. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. James added wood to the fireplace, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cold memories the album had stirred. In the flame's light, the leather cover seemed to glow with its own inner life, each page holding moments that had shaped both their paths. Time had changed them both. He could see that clearly in the progression of images. But looking at those early photos, he recognized something that hadn't changed. The care they'd put into building this place, the love that had gone into every detail. That, at least, had endured, preserved in wood and stone and memory. Katherine's Range Rover crawled along the snow-covered access road, her GPS struggling to reconcile modern satellite data with the hand-drawn directions she'd kept all these years. The old map, creased and annotated in James's precise handwriting, sat on the passenger seat. Turn at the lightning-struck oak, follow the creek bed, look for the stone marker. She'd forgotten how the mountains closed in up here, how the forest pressed against the narrow road like a living thing. Her sleek vehicle, so at home in Manhattan traffic, felt out of place among these ancient trees, just like she did. The stone marker appeared through the swirling snow, a granite boulder she and James had rolled into place 30 years ago. "So people can find us," he'd said, but they'd really placed it there to mark the boundary between the outside world and their private paradise. The GPS chimed, "Signal lost." Katherine smiled grimly. Of course, some places refused to be pinned down by modern technology. She switched it off and pulled out James's directions. The paper was soft with age, his careful instructions faded, but still legible. She'd kept them all these years, tucked away with other memories she couldn't quite let go. The last turn revealed the valley, and Katherine's breath caught. The winter landscape was exactly as she remembered. The sweep of snow-covered meadow, the line of evergreens, and there, the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, determined line. She eased the car to a stop, studying the scene through her windshield. The cabin looked different. The sagging porch had been straightened, broken windows repaired, the general air of abandonment replaced by signs of careful restoration. Someone had been busy up here. The map trembled slightly. In her hands, all her corporate acquisitions, all her billion-dollar developments hadn't prepared her for this moment. She planned to find a deteriorating structure, something easy to condemn and replace. Instead, she found renewal. Katherine checked her reflection in the rear-view mirror, a habit born of countless business meetings. But this wasn't a negotiation over property rights or development plans. This was something far more personal, far more dangerous. The snow was falling harder now. Soon the road would be impassable. It was time to face whatever, whoever, waited in that cabin. Katherine tucked the old directions into her coat pocket next to the property deed. Then she stepped out into the winter air, leaving the warm certainty of her corporate world behind. The newly restored front porch creaked under Katherine's feet, the sound achingly familiar. She noticed the craftsmanship immediately. Whoever had repaired it had matched the original joinery perfectly, even recreating the subtle curve of the handrail that had been James's signature touch. Her hand hesitated over the door knocker. Inside, she could hear the soft sounds of work in progress. The door opened before she could knock, and there he was. Time stopped, crystallized, shattered, all in the space of a heartbeat. James stood in the doorway, a hammer in his work-worn hand, sawdust in his graying hair. The years had carved deeper lines around his eyes, added silver to his temples, but she would have known him anywhere. Recognition blazed across his face, followed by something that looked like fear. The hammer slipped from his fingers, thudding, dully against the wooden floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. "Katherine." His voice was rougher than she remembered, but it said her name the same way, like it was something precious and dangerous at the same time. For once in her life, Katherine Wells, the CEO known for her commanding presence, found herself speechless. All her carefully prepared statements evaporated in the face of reality. James recovered first, stepping back from the doorway. "You'd better come in. Storm's getting worse." The slight limp in his step was new, she noticed, just as he would have noticed her silver hair, her expensive coat, the years mapped across her face. The cabin's interior stopped her in her tracks. Gone was the decay she'd expected. Instead, she found herself in a space being carefully brought back to life. The great room's wooden floors had been refinished, the stone fireplace cleaned and repointed. A fire burned there now, casting warm light on walls she'd once painted herself. "You've been busy," she managed finally, aiming for a neutral tone. "I know I'm trespassing." James moved to the fireplace, putting space between them. "I found the place during the last storm, needed shelter. Then I saw what needed doing, and..." He gestured at the renovations around them. "Old habits, I guess." Katherine walked to the kitchen counter. New wood, she noted, but matched perfectly. To the original, her fingers traced the edge, feeling the precise beveling. "You still do good work. Some things you don't forget." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She turned to face him fully, taking in the worn clothes, the lean hardness that spoke of difficult years. The man she'd known had been a respected contractor, his skill in high demand across 3 counties. What had happened to bring him here, seeking shelter in their old dream? "I saw the blueprints," he said quietly. "You always did have vision. You're the one who made it real." Katherine glanced around the space they'd created together, now being reborn under his hands. "All of this, it was just drawings until you built it." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, enshrouding the cabin in white silence. They were alone with their memories, their mistakes, and the future hanging unspoken between them. James moved to the window, his reflection ghosting against the darkening glass. "I'll pack my things. You probably have plans for the property." "I do." Katherine watched his shoulders tense. "But I think they may need revision." He turned back. To her, hope and wariness warring in his expression. The restored porch creaked again in the winter wind, solid, sturdy, renewed by careful hands that remembered its original shape. Like memory, like love, like second chances neither of them had expected to find. James stood at the half-finished repair of the living room wall, his hands resting on the exposed beams. Behind him, Katherine paced the room, her designer boots incongruous against the sawdust-covered floor. "You could have sold it," he said finally. "Probably should have. I tried 3 times. Katherine stopped at the window, never could go through with it. "And now?" His hands tightened on the beam. "That development company buying up land in the valley, that's yours, isn't it?" She turned to face him. Wells Infrastructures. Latest project, luxury resort, golf course, ski slopes, the whole valley would be transformed. Transformed. The word came out bitter, like we were supposed to be transformed. Your firm's internship, my contracting business expanding to the city. He gestured at the exposed wall. Some things aren't meant to be transformed, Katherine. Some things are perfect just as they are. Nothing's perfect, James. She moved closer, studying the careful repair work. You taught me that. Every building has its flaws. It's how we fix them that matters. The half-repaired wall stood between them like a metaphor. Part restored, part still broken. All of it exposed to the bone. James had been working on it when she arrived, fitting new insulation behind salvaged boards that matched the original walls perfectly. What happened to you? Her voice was softer now. Your business? Life happened. He touched the old injury in his leg unconsciously. One bad fall, one infected surgery, and everything unraveled. Turns out success is more fragile than we think. You could have reached out to the rising star of Manhattan real estate, the woman who chose her career over... He stopped himself, turning back to the wall. It doesn't matter now. The silence stretched between them, filled with the whisper of falling snow outside and the crack of the fireplace behind them. Katherine moved to the hearth, warming her hands. I convinced myself I was doing it for both of us, she said finally. The internship, the promotions, the partnerships, each step was supposed to lead to something bigger, something better. She laughed softly. Now I own half of Manhattan, and the only property I care about is this cabin in the woods. James picked up a piece of salvaged wood, running his fingers along its grain. So what happens now? Your board won't want to keep a rustic cabin when they could build a golf course. My board doesn't control this property. Katherine pulled the deed from her pocket. I never transferred it to the company. It's still in my name. Still ours, really. I never changed that either. Evening settled over the cabin as Katherine wandered into the bedroom she'd once called her own. James had left the room untouched in his restoration work, as if sensing its importance. In the fading light, she noticed a familiar envelope on the dresser, its edges brown with age. Her breath caught. She'd written that letter 30 years ago, left it here the day she went to Manhattan. A letter James had apparently never opened. I found it behind the dresser when I was checking for water damage, James said from the doorway. Didn't feel right reading it now. Katherine picked up the envelope, her own handwriting accusing her across decades. I waited for you to come after me, she said softly. That first month in Manhattan, I jumped every time my phone rang. I waited for you to come back. James leaned against the doorframe. Every weekend I thought, this is it. She'll realize the city isn't worth it. The letter trembled in Katherine's hands. We were both so young, so sure we knew what love meant. She broke the seal, the paper crackling with age. Should we find out what I thought was so important to say back then? James moved into the room, his presence as familiar as the cabin itself. Read it. Katherine unfolded the paper, her younger self's words swimming before her eyes. Dear James, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way to Manhattan. This internship is the opportunity of a lifetime, but that's not why I'm going. I'm going because I'm scared. She paused, her voice catching. James waited silently. I'm scared of how much I love you, of how easily I could give up my dreams to stay here in our perfect little world. I'm scared that in 20 years, I'll regret not taking this chance, and I'll blame you for it. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who can love you without reservation, without ambition, pulling her in another direction. Katherine's hands shook. You deserve someone who can be content with the beautiful life you offer, the life we planned. I thought I could be that person, but these designs, these dreams, they're burning me up inside. I have to know what I can become. Keep reading, James said quietly. I tell myself this is just temporary, that I'll come back once I've proven myself. But we both know that's a lie. You're too honest to live with lies, James. It's one of the things I love most about you. So here's the truth. I'm leaving because I can't stay. And I'm not asking you to wait, because that wouldn't be fair. She lowered the letter. There's more, but it's all the same. Young girl thinking she had to choose between love and ambition. Thinking she was being noble by making the choice for both of us. James took the letter gently from her hands, looking at it but not reading further. I would have followed you, you know, if you'd asked. If I'd known. Would you? Katherine turned to him. You loved it here. The work you did. The life you'd built. I saw how alive you were, creating things with your hands, making people's dreams real. Could you have been happy building corporate offices instead of family homes? Maybe not. He carefully refolded the letter. But I loved you more than I loved being a small-town contractor. I would have found a way to make it work, and resented me for it eventually. Katherine touched his arm. We were both right, James, and we were both wrong. I needed to become who I am, and you needed to stay true to who you were. The tragedy isn't that we chose differently. It's that we thought we had to choose at all. The letter lay between them on the dresser, its long-held secrets finally revealed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in layers of white silence. Time seemed suspended, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would make of this moment. So, James said finally, what do we choose now? The morning paper lay spread across the kitchen counter, its business section dominated by a photo of Katherine at last month's shareholders' meeting. Wells Infrastructure expands. CEO announces landmark resort development. The headline seemed to mock their quiet breakfast, the corporate world intruding on their fragile peace. Your board won't just let this go, James said, gesturing at the article with his coffee mug. That kind of money makes people persistent. Katherine studied him over the rim of her own cup, a chipped mug she'd painted herself decades ago, somehow still intact. The board serves at my pleasure, not the other way around. But her tone betrayed uncertainty. And the investors, in contracts, the whole machine you've built? He wasn't being cruel, just practical. You can't just walk away from billions because you found an old flame fixing up your cabin. Our cabin, she corrected automatically. Then softer. And you're not just an old flame, James. You never were. Her phone buzzed again, the 15th time that morning. Each ignored call and message, making it clearer that her absence had been noticed. The real world was pressing in, demanding answers, requiring decisions. I saw the plans for the resort, James said carefully. Before I knew it was your company. It's impressive. Sustainable design, minimal environmental impact, local employment opportunities. The kind of project that could revitalize the whole region. Katherine's laugh held a bitter edge. Are you actually arguing in favor of demolishing our cabin? I'm saying that maybe the choice isn't as simple as cabin versus resort. He ran, a hand along the counter he'd restored. Maybe there's a way to honor both past and future. Isn't that what you used to say about architecture? That the best designs find ways to preserve what matters while building something new. The newspaper photo showed Katherine in her element. Confident, commanding, every inch the successful CEO. But it couldn't capture the way her hands shook slightly as she reached for the cabin's deed, which lay beside the paper like a challenge. Katherine spread the resort development plans across the kitchen table, their glossy surfaces reflecting the afternoon light. Computer-rendered images showed luxury chalets nestled into the mountainside, a championship golf course sweeping through the valley, ski lifts climbing the distant peaks. At the center of it all, where their cabin now stood, a grand lodge promised 5-star accommodations and breathtaking views. 3 years of planning, she said, tracing the proposed roads with her finger. Every detail calculated, every impact studied, every profit margin projected. My team thinks it's perfect. James studied the plans with a craftsman's eye. The architecture's good, respectful of the landscape. You can see your influence in the design. But it's not just about design, is it? He gestured at the cabin around them. This place, it has soul. Those renderings, they're beautiful, but they're just pictures. This is real. His hand rested on the worn kitchen table, feeling the marks and scratches of 30 years. This is lived. Catherine's phone buzzed again. Roger, her CFO, for the third time that hour. She silenced it without looking. The board meets on Monday. They're expecting my final approval on the project. And if you don't give it, they can't force me to sell this property. She squared her shoulders, CEO confidence returning. But they could make things difficult, very difficult. James limped to the fireplace, stirring the embers back to life. You've spent 30 years building your company, Katherine. I won't be the reason you throw that away. Is that what you think? This is. She joined him by the fire. That I'm having some kind of midlife crisis? Running away from success, back to a simpler time? Aren't you? No. The certainty in her voice made him turn. I'm finally understanding what success really means. Look at these plans, James. Really, look at them. She pulled him back to the table, to the pristine renderings of luxury and profit. I've built these before, dozens of them, and they're good projects. They create jobs, generate wealth, give people beautiful places to visit. But they're replaceable, interchangeable. There are 1,000 developers who could build this resort. Her hand drifted to the cabin's rough-hewn walls. But this place, what we created here, that's irreplaceable. I've spent 30 years trying to prove I could build bigger things, more impressive things. But nothing I've built has ever felt as real as this cabin. Katherine, James's voice held warning. Don't romanticize this. I'm not the same young contractor you knew. You're not the same ambitious architect. We can't just pick up where we left off. No, we can't. She gathered up the development plans, stacking them neatly. But maybe we can build something new, something that honors what we had without trying to recreate it exactly. She pulled out a blank piece of paper, the kind she'd once used for her earliest cabin sketches. Help me find another way. You're still a builder, James. I'm still a designer. Between us, we should be able to figure out how to preserve this place while still developing the valley. There has to be a middle ground between demolition and stagnation. James looked at the blank paper for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached for a pencil. The ridge line, he said, starting to sketch. If you move the main lodge there instead. Katherine felt something unlock in her chest as she watched his hand move across the paper. His strokes were confident, practical, grounded in years of real-world building experience. Just like before, his solid craftsmanship complementing her soaring designs. The development plans lay forgotten as they worked, the blank page between them slowly filling with possibility. The storm hit its peak as night fell, wind howling through the valley like a living thing. Katherine stood at the window, watching ice coat the glass, when her phone finally broke the tenuous peace they'd built. The board's called an emergency. Meeting, she said, reading the message. They've heard rumors I'm reconsidering the development. They're threatening to vote me out. Can they do that? James looked up from their revised plans, scattered across the table. They can try. Her laugh held no humor. 30 years of building an empire, and they think they can just... She stopped, staring at something on her phone's screen. What is it? She turned the phone toward him. There, in stark digital clarity, was a photo of them together on the cabin's porch, clearly taken that morning. The headline beneath it read, Wells Infrastructure CEO's Secret Mountain Romance, $1 billion development at risk. Someone in town must have recognized me. Katherine's voice was tight. It's already spreading online. By morning, it'll be everywhere. James studied the photo, his expression unreadable. The homeless handyman and the billionaire. Quite a story. Don't. She reached for him, but he was already moving away, his limp more pronounced with fatigue. It's what everyone will say. He stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. That you're throwing away your company over some romantic nostalgia. Over a man who couldn't even keep his own business afloat. I don't care what they say. You should. He turned to face her. Your shareholders care. Your board cares. The thousands of people employed by your company care. A notification sound cut through the tension. Another message, another demand for explanation. Katherine silenced the phone with shaking hands. We could weather the storm, she said. Both, literal and metaphorical. I have enough voting shares to what? Fight your own board? Watch your stock price plummet? Sacrifice everything you've built? James's voice was gentle but firm. I won't be the reason your life falls apart, Katherine. I can't be. So you get to make the choice for me? Again? The words escaped before she could stop them. 30 years of hurt behind them. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm's fury and the crackle of burning wood. Finally, James limped to the table and picked up their revised plans. You were right to go, he said quietly. 30 years ago, you were right, and I was right to stay. We both knew who we were, what we needed to become. He looked at her, eyes bright with unshed tears. The question is, who are we now? Dawn broke over the valley, the storm finally spent. Katherine sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, property deeds, development rights, land surveys. She'd been working through the night, her corporate training, finding purpose in crisis. Sign these, she said, pushing a stack of documents toward James. He picked up the first page, eyes widening as he read. You're creating a land trust? For the cabin and the surrounding 50 acres. Her voice was hoarse from hours of phone calls, but certain. The rest of the valley can be developed according to our revised plans. But this space, she touched the cabin's wall, this stays protected, permanently. Katherine, I can't. You can, and you will. She stood, every inch the CEO despite, her rumpled clothes. You're the co-trustee. Your expertise in historical restoration makes you uniquely qualified. The board can't argue with that. And us? She smiled, exhausted but peaceful. That's not in the paperwork. That's just between us. James looked down at the documents, legally binding papers that would tie him to this place, to her, in a way that transcended their past. The trust requires the cabin to be maintained as a historical property, she continued. Open for educational programs, craft workshops, architectural studies, a living example of traditional building techniques. His hands, rough from decades, of work traced over the legal language. You've thought of everything. I learned from the best. She pulled out one final paper. This one's personal, though. An offer to head the restoration division of Wells Infrastructure, if you want it. Outside, the morning sun caught the fresh snow, making the world glitter. Through the window, they could see the valley where the resort would rise, and the protected forest surrounding their cabin, past and future finally finding their balance. Spring came early to the valley. James stood on the newly restored porch, watching crews break ground for the resort in the distance. The morning sun caught the fresh wood where he'd carved a new heart into the beam, not to replace the old one, but to join it. 2 sets of initials, 2 dates, 30 years apart. The Historical Preservation Board approved our proposal, Katherine said, joining him with coffee in their old mugs. The cabin will be the centerpiece of the Heritage Crafts program. In the month since the storm, they'd found their rhythm again. Different from before, tempered by time and experience, but stronger for it. Katherine split her time between Manhattan and the cabin, running her empire while helping James establish the restoration program. He'd already lined up 3 apprentices, young craftspeople eager to learn traditional building techniques. First, workshop starts next week, he said, sipping his coffee. 5 students, all veterans. Something about working with their hands, rebuilding things. They seemed to understand. Katherine touched his arm, understanding in her eyes. She'd learned his full story over these months. The depression that followed his injury, the slow climb back through his love of craftsmanship. They'd both healed here, in their own ways. The board's actually pleased, she said, changing the subject. Our focus on historical preservation and sustainable development has attracted a whole new class of investors. sometimes doing the right thing is also good business. James smiled, remembering their younger selves, who thought love and ambition couldn't coexist. They'd needed 30 years to learn that some things had to break before they could be rebuilt stronger. Inside the cabin, his tools waited for the day's work. Catherine's laptop sat beside them on the table they'd restored together, modern technology at home among the ancient beams. Like them, the cabin had evolved. Solar panels now powered the lights. Satellite internet connected them to the world, but the heart of the place remained unchanged. "We never did finish reading that letter," James said quietly. "The one you left 30 years ago." Katherine leaned against the porch rail. "Maybe some things are better left in the past. We're writing a new story now." Above them, the carved hearts caught the morning light, old and new side by side, marking not an ending or a beginning, but a continuation, a restoration of what mattered most. The autumn evening wrapped the cabin in golden light as Katherine climbed the path from her car. Construction on the resort was ahead of schedule, its elegant buildings rising in harmony with the landscape. But here, in their protected forest, time moved at a gentler pace. She found James on the porch, teaching one of his apprentices the art of hand-cutting dovetail joints. He looked up as she approached, his smile as warm as the day she'd first fallen in love with him. "Perfect timing," he said, setting aside his tools. "I have something to show you." He led her inside, where the cabin glowed with decades of care. Every surface showed the touch of skilled hands, some old, some new, all part of their continuing story. On the table lay a small wooden box, freshly made from the same pine as the cabin's original beams. "Open it," he said softly. Inside, she found 2 sets of keys, the old brass ones she'd kept all these years, and a new set, polished and bright. "The restoration's officially complete," James said, "though I suppose a home is never really finished, is it?" Katherine lifted the keys, feeling their weight. "No, it's not. It grows and changes with the people who love it." Through the window, they could see the valley transformed, not by destruction, but by careful integration of old and new. The resort's buildings echoed the cabin's rustic elegance, while the Heritage Crafts program ensured traditional skills would survive for another generation. "We got it right this time," she said, placing the keys back in their box, "not by choosing between our dreams, but by finding a way to build them together." James took her hand, and they stood in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains. The cabin settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs, no longer just a shelter, but a testament to the power of second chances, to the possibility that what's broken can be made whole again, stronger at the mended places. In the growing darkness, the 2 carved hearts on the beam seemed to pulse with their own inner light, twin beacons guiding them home.